that sell.
Get me some nasty and get it now or someone's getting shot.
And that's a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche of a 1,000 comments.
Selling a hemorrhoid cream to someone who's got hemorrhoids.
Got a whip.
I was born into a deep contradiction.
This stuff's magic.
God, that's so clever.
Hello and welcome to episode 51 of Artifact Live, where we look at the art and science of storytelling with me, Scott McArthur. I hope you enjoyed last week's show where we took some time to reflect on the last 50 shows. And it's been very nice to hear your thoughts and your experiences of the show and suggestions for where we should be going for the next 50. Now, this week, I'm really excited because it's quite an unusual guest I've got. Well, I don't know if you're unusual, Matt, but I think it's unusual how we met. So it's quite nice that we're going to do something different this week. I'm going to look at a perspective from across the water. I've had a few guests from around the world. We've had some Japanese guests, Australian guests, etc. But I think you're the first guest we've had from America, Matt. So I'd just like to introduce to everyone Matt Grawitch. Matt, welcome to Artifact Live.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm not sure if I necessarily want to be the first guest from America. I'd hate to turn your audience off, but we'll give it a go.
Well, I hope you're not the last one. So, Matt, did I pronounce your name correctly, incidentally?
Yes, Grawitch, either one. I've been called much, much worse over the years. So,
where does that come from? It's not a name I'm familiar with.
It is Germanic in origin.
Right. Okay. So tell everybody what it is you do for a living, Matt.
So I am a faculty member at a private Jesuit university in the Midwest. I actually live in the St. Louis area, and I have been working there as a faculty member in the School for Professional Studies, which is the education unit focused on professionals, working professionals. And I've been there for, I guess, going on 15 years now. And it's certainly been quite interesting in terms of the experiences I've had, things that I never thought I'd be doing as a faculty member or things that I'm currently doing as a faculty member. So
what got you into that profession?
Well, I was a doctoral student actually at St. Louis University in the organizational psychology domain. And when I went to graduate, I had a variety of options, but all of the options, or very few of the options, paid all that well. And at the time, I was married and had a young child, so moving wasn't necessarily in the cards if I could help it. And so this position opened up, and I took it, and I've been there ever since.
All right, okay. And you said it's a Jesuit? Did you say Jesuit university?
It is a Jesuit university.
We don't have that sort of thing here at all. So how does that work? Is it got a religious base to it, or what does that mean?
Well, it was founded by the Jesuits, which are a group of Catholic missionaries, or at least that's more or less how they started out. And really, it doesn't have a yes, we have Jesuit priests that teach courses, but there isn't a strong religious bent necessarily to it. Students take theology courses and philosophy courses, but it's not a variety of courses on necessarily Catholic education.
All right, okay. It is something that really differentiates the UK from the US, because the religious thing in America is quite bewildering to many of us here. I'm not judging it. I'm just saying it just seems so powerful. That it's beyond most of our belief that it's there. It just doesn't make a lot of sense in the UK. Is that something that you're aware of, or is it just?
Well, there are Jesuit institutions around the world.
Yeah,
and the Jesuits operate around the world in a variety of places. They do, like I said, a lot of missionary work. In the U.S., there are several Jesuit institutions. And they're known for providing high quality education. Right. So, we attract students because of the Jesuit nature of the institution, as well as where we're located.
Okay. Okay, thank you. In terms of talking about, you said it's the professional life. Is that human resources, organizational design? Is that the sort of the focus of your work?
We teach students from a variety of walks of life. I've had my fair share of folks in the human resources
Right.
and organizational design and consulting domains.
Mhm.
But a lot of times I have students who are in a variety of settings and more or less management positions or wanting to get into management positions. I
Right.
teach a lot of courses at the master's level. And so a lot of these students are pursuing a master's degree for promotion or advancement, sometimes for job change, and sometimes just to improve, how they approach their day-to-day job.
Okay. Okay. We'll maybe come back to that because I'm quite interested in what it is you actually specifically teach at that level, because obviously that's an interesting level to for people to hear more about. So perhaps we could come back to that. But let's talk about social media, because it would be daft not to, because we met on Twitter.
We did.
And where's your head with social media? What do you think about where we are with it in the world today?
Well, I have interacted with a variety of interesting folks over the years, and I've met some terrific people. Several others. I actually team teach a course in our graduate program with someone that lives over in the UK who I met on Twitter.
Wow.
So I've developed a lot of good contacts and relationships with some of the folks that I interact with on Twitter. Of course, I've also seen some of the less desirable aspects of social media play out. So, it's sort of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's a lot of terrific things that come from social media and a lot of connections that we can build. On the other hand, you also have a greater likelihood of falling down maybe rabbit holes that aren't necessarily the most logical rabbit holes to fall down.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And have you experienced the sort of troll behavior or the negative side of the
I've had
social
my fair
media?
share, probably not nearly as many as a lot of other folks have.
Right.
But I try not to engage in activities that are necessarily going to get me canceled or trolled
Mm-hmm.
by the folks that are out there. Although I did recently just get suspended on Twitter for 12 hours for
Did you?
commenting on something that Twitter apparently didn't like. So,
Oh, right. It's an interesting one, that, isn't it? Because I guess again, very similar to you. I mean, I found many interesting people, including your good self on there, that don't always agree with them, but I think, yeah, they're trying. You get that. You can tell when someone, I believe, is a good actor, and you can tell quite quickly. They're really trying to understand things, and they don't have that sort of air of certainty around them that some people who are perhaps not such good actors tend to have. And I've had my share of people who didn't want to have a dialogue with me. They just wanted to shout at me, or didn't want to try and understand me or help me or take me to another place. They just wanted to have a go. But the majority of people I've found, if you manage it carefully, particularly Twitter, it can actually be really rewarding. I mean, I haven't had and I know some people have had terrible experiences on there, but I haven't. I mean, I've mainly had really good experiences. I'm in danger. I don't know how you are with this, but I occasionally feel like I could spend my whole day on there and I have to, step back. But I don't know if that's something that you've experienced, Matt.
I have. There are some days where I go on Twitter and the conversation and the topics that are being discussed by the people that I follow and that follow me are very, very interesting and engaging.
Yes.
And so sometimes I have to very consciously just sort of step away and say, I've got other things I need to do now, and then proceed to get those things done.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is it, mainly just Twitter, or do you use other platforms as well?
I used to be on Facebook, but I spend very little time on Facebook anymore. I check it usually in the morning, and that's about it. I spend most of my time on Twitter if I'm engaging in social media interactions at all.
Yes.
Some of the other ones like Instagram, I just haven't gotten into.
I think there is you could reasonably say that, particularly in the academic domain, there's an awful lot of academics on Twitter that get a lot from it. It seems to be the place that they enjoy the most. I've been, as I've said to you offline, I've been broadcasting now just for a year, and the broadcasters are on Twitch. That's the sort of the broadcasting platform. Have you ever had a look on Twitch?
I've had a look on Twitch, but it's been quite a while, and it's I have not spent a great deal of time here.
It is as I mean, I live near Stratford-upon-Avon, and as Shakespeare would have said, it is the undiscovered country. It is wow. It's so different to LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. And there are very few people on there doing this sort of thing. There is a small community, and indeed this will be broadcasting on Twitch, but it's mainly game people. But if I was predicting anything, and I'm not keen on predicting anything, especially the future, but I think Twitch is going to be the one that's going to pick up in the next 12 months to 18 months. Just because of broadcasting, people are getting more and more into broadcasting, and that's where the people are. That's where the real experts are. You don't find them on LinkedIn, that's for sure. The real experts. So that. Thank you for your thoughts on that. That naturally leads me to the sort of maybe the core topic I'd love to talk to you about, and it's linked to your teaching as well as what you talk about on Twitter. And what's all over the media, and that is the culture war. The idea of that we're in the middle of this embattled war between notionally the loony left and the loony right. Is this something that is as visible in the States as we're led to believe it is?
Well, if you're talking about on social media, absolutely. The social media seems to bring out and amplify some of the weirdest of the folks among us in the U.S. In terms of my day-to-day interactions with people, as a general rule, I'd say a lot of what we see on social media doesn't end up spilling over into normal everyday life, because most people are relatively, and I say relatively, reasoned people who really just want to get along in life and do their daily thing, whatever that daily thing happens to be, and for the most part, pretty much be left alone.
Yeah.
So I don't see a lot of folks necessarily, jumping at or chomping at the bit, if you will, to go out there and try to push some agenda onto everybody else. It's mostly a live and let live sort of society, though you do see a lot of things pop up. Yeah. And mostly those things are amplified by the media, and then doubly amplified by social media.
Yeah. Yeah. And does that come into your teaching at all?
A little bit. I teach a course called Ethical Evidence-Based Decision Making. And one of the weeks that we talk about in there, I've got a whole little pre-recorded mini lecture that I show that talks about logical connections amongst ideas and how you get to things like logical fallacies and conspiracy theories by failing to follow those logical dots to conclusion. Okay.
Tease that out a little bit more for me. I mean, you've got the word just deconstructing the title. I mean, I'm really intrigued by the title of this course. The ethical. What do you mean by ethical? I mean, what role does ethics play in this?
So the way this course evolved, we have an applied analytics master's program.
Okay.
And there was a course within that program called Evidence-Based Decision Making, and the program director had asked me to teach it. So I taught it a couple of times, specifically within his program. Mm-hmm. And the students really enjoyed the course. And so when we were working on enhancing the programs across the school, we decided to make this course a required course. And originally we were gonna break it into two courses. We were gonna have an evidence-based decision-making course and an ethical decision-making course. And the more we started getting into diving into these topics, the more we started to realize that you can't really make good evidence-based decisions without considering the ethics of those decisions. And you really can't make sound ethical decisions without considering the evidence for those decisions. And so instead of trying to break those apart into two separate courses, we decided to combine them into one ethical evidence-based decision-making course.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So how do you go about, I mean, bearing in mind the audience that we have today are mainly in the sort of the comms, organizational development and design, and in general storytellers, writers and filmmakers. How do we get to the point where, like, I'm probably talking about the data first of all, Matt, if you don't mind. And if that's not a good way for you to do it, you don't need to. But for me, it's the first step, I think. How do you encourage people to look for data? Where should people look for data on which to make their ethical decisions? Long question.
Well, I mean, I think a lot depends on the situation, right? I mean, depending upon the situation, what kind of evidence or data we're looking for is going to vary. So in our day-to-day interactions, we make a lot of split-second decisions based more on our past experiences. When we start delving into things where we have a lot less experience and a lot less expertise, that's where we start having to look at data in the traditional way people think about data. And at that point in time, that's where it can be really challenging to sift through what is quality from what isn't, because there's a lot of BS that's out there, and it's couched as being quality data. But even within the published research domain, there's a lot of really bad studies that are out there. Well, of course, a lot of really good studies that are out there. So being able to figure out which ones are which can be quite challenging.
Right. Okay. And how do you encourage people to do that? What can someone, if someone's watching this and say they work in, say they're a chief executive and they're running a company and they're looking at the future of work and they're wondering about, okay, what do we do? Should we go with the sheep who seem to be everyone's talking about hybrid working, or should I go back to the old way, which made sense to me? I made all my money doing that. Or should I be looking at a blend? How would you encourage people to look at that? Is there a way that you could help them look at that? I mean, it's really complicated, Matt. So what would you say to them?
Well, I would say that, first off, nobody has any answers, right? So if people are claiming that they have all the answers, you should put that into the box of, I should be very skeptical about this.
Yes.
One of the other big things that I see people have trouble differentiating is, so there's a difference between what I would call advocates and scientists, right? Okay. And so, not that advocates can't practice science and engage in the scientific method, but the more of an advocacy stance that someone likely has, the more likely their argument is actually going to be one that is directing you toward reaching their desired conclusion, as opposed to what a conclusion might be based on a more breadthful preponderance of the evidence.
Right. Okay.
So trying to figure out what's the angle? So what is the angle of this person and the kinds of information that they're putting out there? Not that conflicts of interest or being an advocate for something necessarily means that they're lying to you, but you should certainly be a little more skeptical of some of the arguments that are put out there by folks that do have a clear conflict of interest, or that are clearly operating more from an advocacy lens.
Right. Okay. Got to pick you up on bullshit. Got to talk bullshit, because it's something that it has. I don't know how to really. It's worried me since I left the scientific world and went into the business world, because within 2 or 3 years of working in business, you can hardly move from the amount of BS. I mean, it is, whether it's Myers-Briggs, left, right, brain, learning style. I mean, God, you could literally go on forever on the amount of BS that's out there in business. And in fact, if I may very quickly tell you a story which will make you giggle, but I interviewed another professor, that one from this side of the pond, and he was telling me a story. We were in a cafeteria in London, and he told me a story. He was developing a new MBA program with one of the universities in the States, and he had suggested that they should teach the MBA students critical thinking skills. And I know there's some contention about that and whether it should be taught or it should be part of all the modules. I know there's dialogue around that, but notwithstanding that, the university decided to do it. However, after 3 years of running the MBA, they had to withdraw it because the majority of the other modules were teaching BS, and the students were saying, "Sorry, there's no evidence that this works." So that made me giggle at the time, but I think it kind of suggests that there is a problem, with evidence in the workplace. I mean, am I over egging that because I come from maybe I'm biased, from the scientific perspective, or is it something that's just very difficult to do with evidence, the business world?
Well, I do think it is difficult to do with evidence, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the world itself is very complex, and yet a lot of research studies and whatnot that are designed are really, trying to look at a cross section of this human complexity, and so it is difficult to tease out what's real necessarily from what's not. A bigger part of the problem with that is that, again, when you've got folks that are putting information out there and claiming, so for instance, like the MBTI, right? This is something that's been around for a good long time, and it's easy to find information on it and easy to find people who say, "Oh, this is great." And in fact, it's not uncommon for me to see, it's become less common, I think, on Twitter, but it used to be very common for people to put their little 4-letter MBTI
profile.
Thank you. On their Twitter bio, and I see that a lot less, although I do still run into it from time to time, and that was a big thing. But it gives the air that this is something that is very credible, when in fact, if you actually start digging into it, you find that the evidence for these profiles and these different types is very weak, to say the least.
Yes.
So, but when you've got all these sources that are out there, whether you're talking about the people who are consulting it, whether you're talking about people who are simply trying to peddle it for other reasons, they've really adopted it and they think it's great and wonderful. All of a sudden, you can be inundated with information that makes it look like this kind of thing actually is legitimate when it might not be.
Yes. Doesn't mean it's bad, but it might not be legitimate. I think that's one of the things. I mean, I used to be more, how would I put it? I was in people's face a lot more historically. I was, what are you doing? This, it doesn't work. There isn't a credible university in the world studying MBTI. But nevertheless, I'm less angry about it now. I think I was an angry young Scotsman, I think, back then. But I still worry that I don't see, what's going to replace it, because there is definitely, I mean, you hear all this neuroscience stuff now. There's all these fads, and one of the big ones at the moment is neuroscience. And obviously neuroscience is a wonderfully complex and fascinating area, but my God, there's so much BS around it now that it's just, well, they call it neurobollocks, don't they? That's the phrase that most people refer to. Even some of the neuroscientists are talking neurobollocks now, with some of the imaging work that they're publishing. But it's difficult. How do we help people? I mean, how do we help people get through that? It's almost like they're wading through mud, but it's quite attractive mud. It smells quite nice. It's not. How do we help them?
Well, I'll say this. Oftentimes, anything that smells too nice is probably too good to be true. Um,
Well said.
one of the things I used to, like you, I used to rail nonstop about that's a bunch of bullshit, and that's all pseudoscience, and move on, right? These days, I guess I'm a little more nuanced with regard to my thoughts on it, in the sense that the question ultimately is what are the trade-offs, right? So are there benefits, and are the benefits worth the cost to accepting the MBTI or any of the other woo kinds of things that are out there? Do you get some benefit out of doing that? And are the costs worth those benefits? Sometimes the answer is probably yes. I mean, is the MBTI really hurting anything in an organization? Probably not. Is it stimulating perhaps conversations around differences in the way different people perhaps approach problems and different aspects of work? Sure. Is it the best way to do that? Probably not. Certainly not if people are walking away believing that their MBTI profile is necessarily accurate, and that 2 weeks from now, if they try to take it again, they're not going to end up with a different profile. So, so there are benefits. The question oftentimes that needs to be asked is, are the costs worth those benefits? And like I said, sometimes the answer might be yes, and sometimes the answer is no. Especially when on the no side, are there unintended consequences that can result if we are not more skeptical or more vetting of what's bullshit and what's not? And sometimes the answer to that is absolutely, right? If you accept some sort of new age treatment over common medical practice, you could be putting your health in jeopardy.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the MBTI probably, if it's managed right, probably doesn't have a lot of those unintended consequences, but you're still paying money for something that's not necessarily going to produce a lot of benefits.
Yes. Yeah. So let's take all of that and push it forward. I'm sure, I'm not certain, but I'm certainly sure that you'll think a lot about where's all this going. You're teaching ethical decision making. You're in the sort of the organizational professional world. Where do you think we're going now, having come through, almost come through this terrible year and a half of pandemic, which, there are a number of consequences which we could probably talk all day about in terms of that. But nevertheless, where do you think organizations are going to go now? What do you think the impact's going to be? Huge question. I'm sorry, but
that is a huge question. I mean, if I were a betting man, and sometimes I am, oftentimes I'm not. Certainly not these days, because I didn't see a lot of things coming that we're getting thrown at us these days. I would say that you're going to see a lot of organizations move to more of a hybrid approach to how they conduct business. Now that brings with it a whole host of issues, right? So you've got to manage when people are going to be in the office. You may have buildings, if you take that approach, that essentially aren't seeing a lot of foot traffic in terms of human contact and interaction. So what do you do with that? I mean, there's a lot of issues that are going to surface. I do think that there's going to be a lot of organizations that, as we get farther away from the pandemic, which when that's going to be, I'm not sure, but I do think you're going to see, probably a lot of organizations try to revert back to exactly the way things were pre-pandemic in terms of their expectations, where other organizations are likely going to adopt a hybrid model. I see very few organizations likely moving to a fully virtual model.
Yes. And how do you think, or have you a perspective on the impact that could have on society or on individuals? Again, a huge question, Matt. Sorry, but be interested in your perspective.
Well, I think the impact becomes bigger when you're talking especially about large companies, because large companies oftentimes are housed in very urban areas, right? And around those companies, oftentimes there's an entire industry. There's restaurants, there's stores, there's things that are up and about. As companies move to allow things that might be more virtual, what I think you're going to see is fewer people necessarily choosing to live in those urban areas, and fewer people patronizing the businesses around the companies that they are employed by. And so that could have an adverse effect on the livelihood of those businesses and their ability to survive. And a lot of times those businesses tend to be smaller businesses, even if they're restaurants and stuff, they might be franchises, or, very locally owned establishments. So there might be a huge impact there, more so than I think there will be on the large companies.
Yes, I think, excuse me, I suspect you're right. And I mean, I'm very much locked in a contradiction with this, because I am drawn to almost the rewilding of city centers. In America, they call them downtown areas. I'm drawn to the reduced impact on the environment in terms of commuting, and so there's that. But I also equally, I agree with you that it's common sense, isn't it, that all these little businesses are going to suffer. That worries me. But also, and maybe hear what you think about this, I worry about we're group animals. We're not meant to be sat in little studios doing this all the time. I personally, and maybe I'm the wrong generation now. Maybe that I need to get out of the way. But I personally, when I set up my own company 10 years ago, it wasn't as difficult as everyone told me it would be. Apart from missing my colleagues, apart from missing going for a pint in the pub after work on a Friday night, and no amount of virtual can replace that. And I for the last, certainly for 8 of the last 10 years, I've really had to manufacture getting together with people so that I got that feeling of so I think, I don't know how you feel about that, but I think that's why the hybrid model is so attractive. I think it's hopefully why it will continue in terms of human health, if you like, well-being.
Right. And I do think that's going to be an attractive reason for organizations to opt for a hybrid model, is that it still requires some face-to-face interaction. I think how well organizations manage the hybrid side of that is going to determine how successful it is in terms of encouraging human interaction and really getting the best of the in-person interactions with the virtual interactions.
Yes.
If it's not managed well, it could just end up being chaos.
Yes. And it probably will be in the short term. It makes me laugh because when I started my career, after my scientific career, I worked for one of the big utility companies here called British Gas. And my first promotion, my first good job, if you like, was personnel officer, and in brackets, welfare. So I looked after social clubs, sports centres, sports clubs, football teams, cricket teams, snooker teams, you name it. 80,000 employees, a massive welfare budget. And then in the 90s, that was all slashed out. It was seen as not necessary. And here we are, it's all coming back, which is really interesting. Is that a similar story in the States?
I think the answer to that is probably yes. One of the interesting things that we observe with companies, right, is when things are going really, really well, we're all about all these extra perks and benefits, right? Things that we don't really give any second thought to what the return on investment is going to be by offering this. When things get a little rough financially, that's when you start to see a lot of those things go away. There wasn't a lot of thought necessarily put into them to begin with. And now, because there wasn't a lot of thought put into them, there isn't any data sitting there saying, yes, these things are providing a return. And so those are the first things that get cut. But then when you end up in situations where, well, I mean, again, none of these companies could have predicted the pandemic, right? All of a sudden, there's this sort of forced isolation. And as businesses start to move back to things that are a little bit more in person, you're hearing employees clamor for more meaningful face-to-face interactions. So whether you're talking about team sports and the kinds of things that you would have managed back in the day, or other kinds of interactions, more meaningful meetings, regular interactions with their supervisor and whatnot. Those are the kinds of things, and companies are saying, well, we don't want people to leave because there's all this talk of this great resignation, right?
Yes.
And so companies are bending over backwards now to try to keep workers, allegedly. I can't say how accurate that is, but some companies are clearly trying to bend over backwards for their employees.
Yes.
And trying to offer some of these benefits to keep employees around, recognizing that employees are more likely to stay at a place where they feel a connection, and those interpersonal interactions help to create that connection.
Yes, I think that's a very nice way to summarize it. Let me ask you about storytelling on itself, because as you know, this show's about storytelling, and it's about, you know, how powerful it can be, where it works, where it doesn't work. And one of your, you know, the second, we talked about ethics, and then it was about decision making, your master's level teaching. Is storytelling something that you include in that teaching, or is it something that you're not currently including, or where is it with your teaching?
Well, we do. So when we originally designed the course, right, and I was thinking about this stuff, I was really adopting a lot of the sort of classical rationality concepts, right? You know, we want to create a logical process that allows us to get from the premises to the conclusion. And not that those things aren't important, but what I have come to reinforce a lot more in this course is the importance of building connection with the people you're trying to persuade or sell on an idea, and the emotional side of that, because at their core, all decisions are emotional decisions.
Yes.
Right. You can list out all of the logical reasons or logical aspects of option one and option two. But at the end of the day, when you go to pull the trigger and make that final decision, emotion is involved in that, because emotion is what helps us to evaluate whether or not those aspects of option A and option B are good or bad.
Yes.
And so without the emotion, you're not being able to make that decision. So being able to ensure that you're making that emotional connection with the audience goes a long way. And stories are really good for that.
Yeah. One of the, I don't know if you've heard me say this on my show, but one of the lines that seems to have resonated with my audience is that facts tell, but stories sell. Facts tell, stories sell. And I think, you know, I know there are extremes on both. Like if you look at someone like, you know, Simon Sinek, who has no experience at all. You know, he has no experience in business, and yet he's a business guru, and all he does is tell stories. Very powerful, and he's very good at it. But there's it's just poof, you know, it's powder puff. But nevertheless, he's massively influential. Then you look at the academic world, and there are very few academics that have moved over into the business world with their research methodologies and their evidence. So it's just the same there. You know, there seems to be I think that there's an opportunity in the middle here for the, you know, don't go as far as the gurus, but don't stay in your ivory tower either. You know, and I don't know how you feel about that. Am I being unfair, or does that resonate with you?
Well, I don't think you're being unfair. I think what you're really getting to is the science practice gap, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
It's one thing to do science. It's another thing to be able to translate that science into something that's useful without getting too far away from what the science actually says, which is where we oftentimes run into a problem. And so I review for a lot of journals, and one of the biggest criticisms I make, it's almost inevitable when I'm peer reviewing a journal article, is I tell the authors, stop overhyping your results. You're making all of these claims that are not actually logical based on the data that you provided. So stop it. And that's the real challenge, right? Is how do you take what the science says and translate it into practice in a way that is useful to people, but in a way that doesn't get too far away from what the science actually says. And we struggle with that. Because, and I think one of the big things about academics, right? And I can say this because I am one. One of the big things about academics is that they all want their research, their pet research domains to be the most important thing, right? Because to them, it is the most important thing.
Of course, yes.
And so when they're talking about their results, even though the results might be kind of ho-hum and not all that big of a deal, boy, they hype those things up in order to try to make their research seem important.
Yes.
And I think that's human nature, right? We want to be important, whether it's important to our families, whether it's important to our coworkers, or whether it's important to society in general. We want to feel as though our work and our existence has meaning.
Yes, there was. I don't know if you saw it. There was a lovely piece of research done a couple of years ago where they looked at the words being published in the scientific journals, and they were obviously using technology to do it. And the growth words were words like breakthrough, world beating. These massively onomatopoeic words about the research. But I mean, the science practice gap has worried me for years as well, and even today. I mean, a friend of mine runs a business school, one of the best business schools in the world, and she was advertising today for a junior lecturer in HR, and I had a look at the spec, and it didn't mention, not even once did it mention experience in HR. It was PhD in HR. And like, what does a PhD in HR know about HR? I mean, the answer to that is diddly squat, but it does strike me that there's an opportunity there. I think it happens on both sides, incidentally, Matt. I think it could work the other way as well. But it does bewilder me somewhat that more academic institutions don't say, look, if you were an HR director, we've got a senior lecturer role for you here, or even a head of department role for you here, because you know how to do HR and you've run departments. You might not know how to do a poster or write an academic article, but we can unveil that quite quickly, can't we? Those of us who have worked in both worlds. But it does strike me as being a bit odd, because it would give the academic institutions more credibility, and it would give the organisations more chance of doing things properly. So I just think it's a win-win, but it's a barrier that's rarely crossed in my experience.
I would agree with that. I will say this, a lot depends on what the approach is. What is it that the academic institution is trying to achieve with their particular program, right? Are they trying to develop scientists and scholars in that domain, or are they trying to develop practitioners? Are they trying to develop something in between?
Yeah.
If you're trying to develop something in between, or practitioners, making sure that some practitioners are involved in offering some of the courses at a bare minimum would seem to be kind of important. One of the things, going back to what we do in our academic unit, right, there are a handful of full-time faculty members, and the rest of our courses are taught by adjuncts. And almost all of the adjuncts are people who are out there in the particular domain in which they're teaching. So if they're teaching organizational development, they are working in the OD domain. If they're teaching, cybersecurity, they're working within the field of cybersecurity.
Right. And it would be nice to see the opposite as well, wouldn't it? It'd be nice to see companies saying, we would really value having some senior academic input into our processes, because they would bring that evidential, hopefully rigor into those organizations who are drawn to, like moths to the fad flame. It would really help, I believe. So I think it's a win-win. for me, it would be a complete win-win.
It is. I think one of the challenges with academics, though, is they try to do everything based on the gold standard sometimes.
Yeah.
And companies aren't necessarily looking for randomized controlled trials.
No.
Right. So they're looking for something that's researchy enough that it provides a good return and makes them reasonably comfortable with the conclusions that come out of it. They don't necessarily need the highest tier. And I think sometimes academics have difficulty tamping down what their expectations are about what they can and can't do for organizations.
Absolutely. And again, that's something that I tried and failed in the consulting world, because I was trying to encourage the whole notion of experimentation, rather than, I mean, in organizations, you occasionally get pilot schemes, but you very rarely get, set up, double blind type, as you say, gold standard. But it isn't impossible. I mean, certainly things like, and I've made some in my consulting career, but particularly with performance management, I did make some leeway with that, because I would say, well, we'll try using, a bonus scheme method there. We'll try using a shared scheme here, and we'll do nothing there. And I have done that in organizations, but I think on the whole, you're absolutely right. It takes too long. But they're still making the same mistakes that were making 30 years ago. So maybe you would think their appetite would change. Maybe I'm just dreaming. But that's how I feel about it. Anyway, Matt, listen, we're coming towards the end. I can't believe that. It's already 45 minutes. Can I ask you a question about you personally again? About what's your favorite book? What's your favorite story? Big question. These big questions.
I've read a lot of good books over the years. I tell you what, one that I'm actually, and I'll mention it only because it's sitting right here, because I've been reading it for something else that I was working on, is Sun Tzu's The Art of War. It's actually a really easy read, but it's a very insightful read, and certainly for a book that was, created eons ago. A lot of the lessons learned from that still apply today, and so I find that book to be a fascinating read every time I pick it up.
Fascinating, thank you very much. Gosh, I haven't read that since I think I was at university. I'm going to pick it up again. Thanks. And what about a fiction book? What sort of fiction do you like?
Unfortunately, I haven't read a single fiction book in quite a while. Probably the last fiction book that I actually read that I really, really enjoyed was Dan Brown's book with regard to the Da Vinci Code and that series. I enjoyed that. It was interesting, but also gave me a good escape. It kind of tied nice enough into the domains of the kinds of things that I'm interested in, as well as positioning it kind of in a fictitious way.
Yeah, very good. Yes. I always say that they are terribly written, but absolutely compelling books. It's like he can't write in English, the guy, but his storytelling is fantastic. I just, I share that. Weirdly, I read the Da Vinci Code again just last week, which is interesting. Well, thank you very much, Matt. That's been a fascinating chat. And if people wanted to know more about your work or to find you, where's the best place to find you?
Well, obviously, you can find me on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is @Grawitch. You can also, if you email me, I'm more than happy to respond to emails, and my email address is matt.grawitch@slu.edu. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn. And I guess I should spell my last name, or is it going to be on the screen?
It's on the screen. It's on the screen. You're okay. That's fine. Don't worry. Well, Matt, thank you very much for being part of Artifact Live, and I hope we can speak again sometime in the future.
Well, thank you, Scott, and I appreciate the time.